from Ballistic Tech, and today we are of course checking out the Logitech G923 TRUEFORCE sim racing wheel. Over the last couple years, I've really got into sim racing, moving from playing on controller and simcades and basically sending everybody else in the lobby into the shadow realm and just generally getting more immersed in the esports and sim racing world. I recently did a video unboxing and giving my first impressions on the Logitech G920 and G29. And after that, Logitech was nice enough to send me the G923. Now, my videos tend to be extremely detailed and pretty long as well. I do have timestamps and markers in the secret bar, so you can jump to the section that you really want to see. Let's see how many of you guys can actually make it to the end. So the Logitech G923 is the most recent iteration on the G25, G27, and G920/G29 racing wheels. Now, it obviously has the all black new color scheme, which I really like, and I think a lot of other people like as well. But you've probably heard that in general, the construction and force feedback system hasn't changed in terms of having that dual motor helical geared force feedback system. So a lot of people are like, WTF, Mike, what's different? I will say that once you get your hands on the Logitech G923 and try it in a racing game that has the Trueforce SDK implemented, you'll immediately know what's new about the G923 and pretty much whether or not it's going to be something you want to consider. But that is very, very difficult for a lot of people to do in the current global climate with COVID going around and all of the lockdowns. It's going to be hard for people to get into a big box store, and you might not feel safe doing it. So I'm going to do my best to explain every single feature, what it's like to use, and hopefully tell you whether or not it's a wheel you want to pick up. So this time around, both the Xbox and PlayStation version of the G923 are just referred to as the G923. Both versions of the wheel are still PC compatible, and great news, both this generation and the last generation of wheels are going to be compatible with the next gen of console. So you'll be able to get punted into the first turn of Monza on the first lap and every lap after that from the comfort of your own couch in 4K on your big screen TV on your either Series X, Series S, or PS5 console. So the MSRP of the G923 is $399 US. That's actually the same launch price that we saw for the previous generation of wheels, which came out back in 2015. Those older wheels have also seen a reduction in MSRP according to the Logitech site. They are now listed at $299. You'll hopefully see that reflected on prices in retailers, but keep in mind scalpers and third-party sellers on a lot of sites, as well as, moms just selling off their kids' stuff for going to parties and not wearing a mask. They probably won't abide by the MSRP. I think the overall design goal Logitech was going for here was to take what is essentially one of the best entry-level wheels for the price on the market and improve it. In doing so, they're also creating a bit of a two-tiered system in their product lineup. So even if you don't agree with the launch MSRP of this wheel, it's creating more choice there, and overall that's good for consumers. So Trueforce is likely going to be the biggest deciding factor in whether or not you want to pick up this generation of wheel or the previous generation of wheel. But what is it, and how is it going to make you more like Fernando Alonso? Trueforce is essentially kind of a three-factored improvement on these wheels. We've got new hardware and firmware on the wheel. We've got a new communication kind of protocol for communicating between the wheel and the games. And then on the games, Logitech has created a new SDK, which allows the game developers to send information directly from their simulation and audio engines to the wheel through that new protocol. I'll go into a lot more depth on this really quickly, but I do want to touch on a couple other small improvements for those of you who probably aren't going to make it through the entirety of the video. In the pedals, we've got a new progressive brake spring, which replaces the G29 and G920's real feel brake spring. We also have increased functionality on the Xbox version to put it more on par with the PlayStation version of the wheel. And then lastly, they have a new dual clutch launch system, which will help you get off the line quicker and standing start races. Get into the nitty gritty of the improved hardware and the main differences between this wheel and the last generation. Now, I talked with the guys at Logitech for a pretty long time, so thank you to them. They answered all of my questions and even more, letting me know about all the new features of the wheel so I can share that information with you. In terms of the new motor drivers, they're supposed to be able to deliver torque and voltage to the motors, which are the same motors in the same dual force feedback kind of configuration that we're used to from Logitech, but it's doing so more effectively. I really liken this to my experience with 3D printers. You can drastically improve the quality of your 3D printer by upgrading the motor drivers. So you can print faster, get better print quality, and then also reduce the noise just by swapping out the motor drivers without touching the actual motors. In terms of the faster polling rate, it's pretty simple. They've increased the maximum polling rate up to 1000 hertz. So that, in combination with sending more information from the SDK, means you've got a total increase in throughput and bandwidth. So you're getting more information down to the wheel. They noted that their previous generation wheels and a lot of the wheels on the market are somewhat hamstringed by the fact that they're using protocols which were created upwards of 20 years ago when USB 1 was the kind of standard. Then lastly, we have an upgraded ARM processor, which is hopefully going to be able to take all that extra information it's getting and process it, and then new firmware running all of this to wrap things up and again provide better force feedback. I touched on these a little earlier, but some of the other small changes include increased functionality on Xbox. The Xbox version of the G923 gets 5 more inputs. So you've got the addition of a plus and minus button, then you've got a rotary dial left and right, and a return button. That's 2 less than the PlayStation versions of this generation and last generation wheels, but still, a drastic improvement. The Xbox version of the wheel also now includes the LED RPM gauge, which is a nice addition as well. It still has the kind of same animation of going from the outside to the inside and then flashing to let you know when to change gear. They did change the LED colors. I did ask Logitech, what was the specific reason the G920 didn't have those additional buttons and RPM gauge, and they noted that it was essentially a issue or limitation of the Xbox One's actual controller specification when it first launched. Since then, 5 years down the road, that specification has been improved. Xbox has added things like better HID support in general. So now they're able to support the extra buttons, the RPM gauge, and the additional throughput necessary for Trueforce to work. I really like that, the Xbox version is more up to par with the PlayStation version. If you were on Xbox and PC, a lot of people ended up getting the G29 and only playing on PC just because of the extra buttons. Now that those are more on par, you can play games like Assetto Corsa, F1, Project Cars, and do things like have traction control, ABS, brake bias, differential settings, ERS settings, all on dials and buttons instead of having to move to the multifunctional display, pick it, and then increase it while you're trying to, race around instead of poly lap. So you can do your best F1 driver, making settings per turn with the extra buttons. I already mentioned the all black color scheme, but I'm going to mention it again because I think it looks great. Hashtag matte black everything. I think it looks a whole lot more aggressive and kind of motor sporty in general. Really, the only touch of color now you see on here is the blue aluminum centering ring on the steering wheel. On the Xbox version, the ABXY face buttons also have a little splash of color. We still have hand-stitched real leather on the wheel. It still feels really, really nice, but there is a new stitching pattern. The older version of these wheels had kind of like a baseball stitch, I'll call it. Now we've got this new, really, really nice premium flat stitch, which is more indicative of what you'll see on higher end motorsports wheels, but also higher end sim gear. For those of you interested in how the new brake pedal feels, hold off on that. When we get into kind of more use cases, I'll talk about that in depth, and I think I'm going to have a very different take than a lot of people. But in general, the rest of the wheel in terms of construction and materials is essentially the same as last gen. Same number of rotation degrees, that's 900 degrees, still uses the same Hall effect sensor. I mentioned the motors are the same. Setup of this new wheel is exactly the same as the previous generation wheel, very straightforward. There's still that recess in the bottom of the wheelbase where you can plug in the power pedals, and then there's an optional port for plugging in the driving force shifter. That last generation shifter is still compatible with this new version of the wheel. A lot of people hoped that there would be something like some type of expandable handbrake mod that could work with the wheel. Unfortunately, that hasn't been done, but there are some third-party handbrakes which you can buy, which do a little weird USB pass-through thing. They're not officially licensed third-party vendors or anything like that, but people on r/sim racing have noted it works with the G920 on console. So if you're looking for that, just hit up that subreddit and check it out. You've got the same cable management wrap down there, so you can wrap up the excess cable. You don't have them around for people to trip on. It does have the recesses, so you can pass through the cables without pinching them onto your desk. You've got pretty much the same mounting system we've had around since the G25, I believe. Little screw down clamps that clamp it to the bottom of your table. There are spacers on this which you can remove if you have a thicker table. In addition to that, it does also have the same 2 hard mounting threads, which are metal. So if you're mounting it to a rig, you can get some bolts, I think they're M6, and screw those in to really give you the best force feedback from the wheel not moving around. After you get the pedals plugged in, the pedals still have the same flip down carpet gripper system. It is really hard to get this to stay still on something like a hardwood floor, but there are also 6 hard metal mounting points on that as well, so you can mount it down to your rig if you happen to have one. The pedal plates are adjustable. There's 3 different positions you can move them in for each pedal. So all of my fellow wannabe Ayrton Senna Hill Toe boys, rejoice. You can hopefully get those pedals in a spacing that will suit your driving style. After you get the wheel set up, if you're on PC, you're going to need to start to use G-Hub. Now, I know a lot of people have a little bit of pause when they hear G-Hub. When it first came out in early access, it was buggy and not all that performant. The G923 will not be supported in LGS or Logitech gaming software. RIP Logitech gaming software. Put an F in the comments for LGS. I really enjoyed it overall over the, I guess, 10 or so years I've been using it. I like the interface and knew where everything was, but all of Logitech's newer peripherals and hardware have required G-Hub, so now is a good time to move over to G-Hub. In general, everything worked for me. The wheel was detected. I was able to adjust the sensitivity, turn on and off Trueforce, adjust the torque, change all the button mappings, and it worked. It also has the auto game switching. So getting into the general use and feel of the wheel, I definitely think I've noticed it feels a bit smoother when just turning it without any effects coming through the wheel. This could be a little bit of placebo, or the fact that my G920 and G29 are both like 3 or 4 years old now. So, you know, there's gonna be some wear and tear and a little bit of difference in there. But I will say that there's definitely a difference in the kind of constant force that comes through the wheel. It feels punchier once you get some effects coming through it. This is all stuff I'd associate with the new motor drivers because it still has the same motors and overall force feedback system. Did notice, I think the centering speed does seem to be a little bit faster. Again, it's hard for me to judge. I don't drift much, but hopefully you guys might be able to notice that you don't have to throw it as much when you're kind of switching directions in a drift. One thing I'm really excited about that they improved was the previous generation's dead zone, where you just didn't get much from the force feedback. That's been dialed almost completely out on the G923, which is really great for when you're doing high-speed corners. You can get a feel for how the car and the tire is loaded up and just get more information in that zone. All of the other inputs, the paddle shifters, D-pad, the face buttons, the dial, and the return buttons, all those feel pretty much exactly the same as on the G920 and G29. Unfortunately, that does include the kind of LSB and RSB, L2, L3, R3 buttons. To me, these are kind of the least premium part of the wheel. They work, you can tell you've pressed them in every single time, but they just don't feel great, and they obviously don't sound great. So that's something I wish that they would kind of improve once they do a more major redesign of their wheels. Moving down to the pedals, again, same construction, same general kind of mechanics going on in there. Will from Boosted Media did do a complete teardown of both the wheelbase and the pedals. He noted that the springs that are in the clutch pedal and the gas pedal are pretty much identical. The major difference in the pedals is going to be the new progressive spring in the brake pedal. And here I think I'm going to have a different take than most other people. In the previous generation, the G29 and G923 had what they called a real fill brake pedal. This essentially was a rubber stopper which acted as a progressive spring. So you had a normal spring that moved in the pedal stroke, and once you got to a certain point, the real fill stopper became much more harder to press down. It also had a non-linear mapping. A lot of people didn't like this on the Logitech G29, particularly if you were using a desk chair at like a desk, then it was pretty hard to press down. And I will say that is true. And it either meant that the pedals would move forward or that your desk chair would move backwards. And it shows, I think, that Logitech were listening to the customers. There were a lot of people extremely outspoken about not liking it. So on that previous gen, a lot of people either ended up completely taking out the rubber stopper, which I think is a terrible idea. A, it creates a horrible dead zone at the end of the pedal stroke. And B, since it does have a nonlinear mapping, which you notice is at the end of, towards the end of the pedal stroke, it's also kind of wonky. I advise to not completely take it out. Some people put in softer rubber stoppers, kind of like third party. You could 3D print them or buy them off of eBay, which is a better result. But overall, I learned to kind of really enjoy that rubber stopper and think it's a better solution than the progressive spring, because it quickly helped you identify exactly when you got to about 50% braking, and then from there on you could modulate kind of more pressure wise in terms of threshold braking and getting to the specific percentage of braking that you want. I feel that muscle memory works a lot better when you're modulating pressure than when you're modulating kind of millimeters of pedal stroke. You know, there are cars in iRacing like the Porsche Cup car where you can't go above like 70% braking. So it was really nice to be able to get to that 50%, be able to modulate the pressure to get up to that exact amount of braking I want without locking up. In general, higher end load cell brakes, they have very little travel and you have to modulate a lot more pressure and they're a lot harder to press. Now, with those load cell pedals, they're actually measuring the amounts of force that you're putting into the pedals, and the G29 pedals did not do that at all. They were still measuring the amount of distance that you were pushing them in. Now, given all of that, the progressive spring still does get harder to press in as you push in the pedal stroke, so you can get that sting modulation, but I just don't think it's as good. You can still do something like put in a rubber stopper in order to increase that. There are other third-party, mods that of course aren't supported by Logitech, but there's like a true brake and load cell pedal mods and things like that I would be willing to take a look at if any of you guys are listening. But yeah, I'm a bigger fan of the kind of old G29 style brake pedal, but I think I can get used to and will likely have to get used to the new progressive spring on the new system. So getting into gameplay, you're going to get the best experience and most out of Trueforce when you're playing a game that has implemented the Trueforce SDK. With that, devs are able to take the output of their sim engines and audio engines and send them directly over the SDK to the wheel, which is able to use all the improved hardware to process and send that to the motor and give you better force feedback. That's kind of the complete ecosystem that you need to have to get the most out of the wheel. One thing I'm hoping is that this will maybe make it easier for game devs to implement the wheel support, because they have to do less kind of canning of effects, taking complex simulation dampening models and stuff like that and then dumbing them down into something that can be transferred over USB and process. They're sending more of that information directly to the wheel, and then it's able to process it to give you the right kind of either kinesthetic or vibro-tactile feeling, which we'll talk about in a little bit. At the moment, there are 4 supported Trueforce games. We've got Grid 2019, which I actually haven't played yet, but we do have Assetto Corsa Competizione, which is a very popular sim title. We have GT Sport, which is probably the most popular title on console, specifically PS4. And then finally, we have most recently added iRacing. Logitech noted that Codemasters is working on getting Trueforce implemented into more of their games. Specifically, before the end of 2020, we should be able to see F1 2020 and I believe Dirt Rally 2.0 get support for Trueforce. Logitech seemed very confident when I was talking to them that there won't be a problem in the future of games getting Trueforce support. Basically, Logitech, since they've been around for so long, they're one of the first wheels that usually get integrated into a lot of games because they're such a wide user base and they're pretty ubiquitous. And game devs use engines when they're developing games. So once Trueforce has been integrated into an engine, once the subsequent game comes out, they'll already have that code base there so that they can just kind of port it up and get Trueforce implemented in the new game and pass all that new physics stuff that they're hopefully doing directly into the SDK. So the first Trueforce title that I decided to try was Assetto Corsa Competizione. This is probably my second most played sim. It is the official GT series sims. I usually hop in and drive around as David Perel and use the Ferrari 488 GT3 car. The wheel was recognized by the game immediately. You can set up your own presets, and it also had all the button mappings set up by default, so you didn't have to worry about going in and mapping them one by one. The pedals read, the wheelbase read, all 900 degrees and all that kind of stuff worked out of the gate. There was a new setting in there for Trueforce, and it's basically dialed all the way up to 100. So after I got done plunking around in there, I took the car out and got driving. So ACC utilizes both their audio engine and physics engine to send information to the wheel, and it's noticeable immediately. As soon as you get into the pits and you can feel the car start up and the engine revving, you can feel it through the wheel. You can actually hear it through the wheel as well because the motors are vibrating. So, car's turning on. Oh! So I kind of knew what to expect there, but it's still kind of surprising. And it's moving the wheel, which is kind of interesting. So as you rev the engine, you can hear that coming through the wheel, which is a new experience for me and very, very cool. Now, I knew what to expect. I knew this was going to happen, but I couldn't help but smile. People who have something like the Thrustmaster TGT, which has a transducer in it, they might be more used to it. And a lot of people put transducers on their rigs to kind of get those engine notes and things like that. The implementation here doesn't use a transducer. It's using the motors and that geared driven system to kind of vibrate the wheels in a very, very quick manner to give you those sensations. So there's a video of, I think, Max Pappas, who's a former Indy driver, and he actually designs steering wheels now. And he's trying it for the first time. And when he first feels it, he goes, wow, it feels real. And after trying it for the first time, I know what he means now. When you drive a real car, even just a normal road car, when you start up the engine, you can feel kind of everything the engine is doing through the wheels and oftentimes through the pedals and of course through your butt and things like that. And you're getting that, and it feels fairly realistic. It's at least a lot more information than you would normally be getting without it. So getting the car actually out onto the track, the first thing I noticed immediately was all of the road effects, which I think ACC implements pretty well. But things like bumps in the road, changes in tarmac or pavement or concrete or whatever characteristics the road might have, curbs, of course. But one thing that took me by surprise was, of course, when I first went off, which was pretty much in my first lap, you could feel the tires get dirty and pick up stones and dirt. You can, of course, hear that in ACC. When you come back on the road, you hear all the pebbles and stuff bouncing around, but you can feel it through the wheel, and you can feel that the car just doesn't have the same amount of grip. So you're just getting a lot more information kind of all the time, which is kind of cool. Let's drive off track. Whoa, okay. So it feels punchier. That's kind of cool. I can feel the rocks and dirt on the road, or on the tires, that is. And then as you drive on more and that starts to clean up and the pebbles and dirt come off, you can feel that as well. That took me by total surprise. I haven't heard anybody comment on that. And I love that kind of extra sense of immersion and the combination of the visuals of the dust and dirt. Then you get the audio experience that Assetto Corsa is feeding to you. And then you also get the tactile sensation coming through the wheel. All that added together is just a new level of immersion that I think is really cool. Another interesting thing I noticed was that you can actually feel something like traction control. You turn up the traction control. What it's doing essentially in the game engine is it's cutting the power of the engine. So you can actually feel that through the wheels. I feel like I can definitely feel the RPMs getting cut when the traction control kicks in, because that's kind of what one of the things traction control does. Something similar with ABS, it's gonna pulse the brakes to keep slowing down the car without locking up. You can feel that as well. Now, if you dial ABS all the way down like I did to try out, and you do happen to lock up the brakes, it felt absolutely violent with the volume turned up to 100. Oh, that was very, very violent compared to when the ABS kind of kicks in. So imagine I'm probably flat spotted my tires now. And it's probably because, like, you've completely locked up. You're actually creating a flat spot in the tire. And that's probably somewhat audio. It could also be physics based. But I love that you get that amount of detail in the game. So talking a little bit more of kinesthetic and physics-based force feedback, things that you get through the wheel. When you start cornering and moving the weight around the car a lot more, you start to get a lot more impression of what's going on here. The first thing I notice is that when going down straights, because you have that smaller dead zone of force feedback, when you're doing high speed corners, as I mentioned, you just have a better feeling of how the car is loaded up, and you can go into those corners with more confident, knowing that like you're not just all of a sudden gonna lose traction because you're putting too much forces through the wheels and are not able to maintain grip. The next thing I noticed was a lot more of the subtle things going on with the car. There's these very interesting kind of cues that you're getting when you're going through a corner to tell you things like whether or not you're oversteering and understeering. So instead of just going light and then you have to figure out, what's happening with the car, and maybe you're getting like a little bit of tire scrubbing when that's happening, you're getting these like interesting pull and tugs at the wheel, and they're kind of have different frequencies and different amounts of strength depending on what the car is doing. What I thought I felt, and again, I don't have that much time on the wheel yet, is when you're understeering, the car kind of gives you like a tire hoppy kind of sensation that you can feel to let you know, hey, if you're putting in more steering, you're just going to continue to go on straight. And when you're oversteering, to kind of maybe emulate the back of the car coming around, you get like this kind of like pulling sensation, like at a lower frequency, but more slightly intense, to tell you like you're going to need to counter steer in order to get the car straightened back up and to do what you want. So that's very, very interesting. I definitely did not remember feeling that on the G29. And I think at first, all of this new information is a little bit of an increased cognitive load. You have to kind of learn what the wheel is trying to tell you. So I'm starting to be able to slightly distinguish between the different types of feedback that I'm getting. Bumps in the road, curbs in the road, dirty tires, traction control kicking in and cutting the engine, versus when you kind of oversteer off or understeer off the road like that. Now, this might be a little bit too much for people. Definitely on 100, I think it was a little bit too much for me. I initially turned it down to about 55, and that's where I've been driving it for the last kind of like 3 or 4 hours that I've been playing that title. I think once I learn a little bit more how to recognize the differences between, traction control, ABS, oversteer, understeer, kind of what the engine is telling me and all that kind of things, I think I could potentially become a little bit quicker because I'm just understanding what is going on with the car better. Next, I tried iRacing, and this is actually the sim I've been spending the most time in recently. The implementation here is pretty different than it is in ACC. When the wheel support was patched into the game, it was kind of a like stealth patch. They put it in there so that people with the wheel could experience it and play around with it via the app.ini file without, kind of exposing the existence of the wheel to the world. Since then, in more recent patches, they've exposed some of those settings into the UI, so you can turn on and off Trueforce via there. There is one setting, I believe it's the gain, that you will have to go into the app.ini file to change. So that's less than ideal. I like that instead of Corsa Competizione, just put it right there in the UI so you can turn it up and down. The other major difference, which again is a little disappointing compared to ACC, is that you either have to choose between getting the audio engine information or the physics engine information. And this is basically tied to iRacing's 2 different sound engine implementations. They've got direct sound, which if you use that, you're going to be getting the engine notes and the audio engine information. And then they have something, I think it's called X Audio 2, which is supposed to be more of a surroundy type improved audio engine. And when you use that engine, you are going to be getting the physics information. Regardless of which implementation you choose in iRacing, you're still going to get the benefits of having that increased frequency and overall increased bandwidth of information being sent to the wheel to generally improve the force feedback experience. So one thing I do recommend you hopping into the app.ini file to do is increasing or modifying that gain in order to change the overall volume of the effects coming to the wheel. I thought 10 was way too kind of subtle, so I increased it all the way up to 100, and that was just way too intense. So I ended up settling again around like 45 for the physics implementation. I did try the direct sound audio engine, and it definitely improves on the overall immersion of the wheel. The physics engine implementation just gives you, I think, a little bit more information about what the car is doing. But in general, TrueForce adds a lot to the experience. It increases the overall immersion. So the last title I tried was GT Sport, which was of course the only console title that I have. And I hopped in there and noticed initially I was a little bit confused because when you go to the options, it doesn't show the G923 as a wheel option in there. I'm told that in a subsequent patch coming to GT Sport that you will see a wheel option for it. It does see the wheel as a G923, but the way GT Sport has implemented it, if you want to change the button mappings for now, you have to go to the G29 and change the button mapping. So for instance, if you're doing a a Super Formula race and you need the boost button mapped, you would do that on the G29. Again, hopefully in a subsequent patch coming pretty soon, they will expose the G923 as a wheel where you can do the mappings there. You can change the volume of the overall TrueForce effects by changing the vibration settings. So it has a volume slider from 0 to 150. If you're not feeling like you're getting as much information as you want, you can turn that up and amplify those effects. I will say that the wheel experience is improved with the G923 over the G29. Again, in general, you're getting more punchier and increased torque through the wheel with the new TrueForce implementation and the hardware improvements. It was interesting to see kind of how different games and engines implemented it. It did vary. So again, I think ACC has the best implementation. After that, I'd say iRacing with the physics engine, although I wish that they had blended things together. And then finally, GT Sports, I thought was on the lower side of things. It felt like maybe it was more audio engine coming through and less of the physics stuff, but I'm not sure about that. And then again, all of this can be changed in patches as they change how their implementations are done. One of the most interesting things I did was switching between the G923, which I had mounted on my desk, and my G29, which I had hard mounted to my dedicated sim rig. It was quite kind of weird going back and forth, especially knowing that they have essentially the same force feedback system configuration and the same motors in them. I've already noted that it feels punchier, it feels better delivered on here, but the big thing was just like you notice how much less information you're getting on the Logitech G29. You're getting all the major force feedback events, bumps in the road, the curbs, getting crashed into, the steering wheel going light when you're kind of sliding the car around, be it an understeer or an oversteer, some wheel hop and things like that. But just in between that, you're not getting in the engine notes, you're not getting a clunk when you shift the car, you're not getting as many road effects. On the G923, you're just getting information all the time. The last thing I did try out was the dual clutch integration on the wheel. I mostly tried it in iRacing, as that's where I do the most kind of standing start races with both the Mazda and the Porsche Cup car. And some of the kind of community races I do also have standing starts. And too long didn't read or too long didn't watch, it works. And it works very, very well and very, very consistently. I might end up doing a full dedicated video on that feature specifically. So if you have any questions or definitely want to see that video, leave something in the comments below. The reason I like this so much is that it's on an entry-level wheel and it kind of democratizes the idea of having a dual clutch system. Things like the higher-end Fanatec wheels have dual clutch paddles on them. Asher Racing, I think Turn Racing is implementing some of his. There's a new wheel coming out from a company called GSI, and they have an option for paddles. But these are $400, upwards of like $2,000 when you get into Cube controls and other brands like that. So it's considered kind of a higher-end feature that you're getting on an entry-level wheel. Now, if you're on PC, you can do some really roundabout things to kind of spoof this in software on the operating system. So you can use something like a virtual joystick and then use an X mapper to map a button on your controller to that joystick. And that's essentially what's happening in firmware on the wheel. So you can take the wheel from your PC to your console and it will still work on both of those, which I really, really like. The way things work is you put it in a special firmware mode. You assign a button to the dual clutch, put the clutch in, and then figure out a bite point by going up and down. And when you notice the car is moving, you figured out your bite point, you take it out of the programming mode and just use it in the race. You push down the clutch, press the dual clutch button, put it into first gear, rev up the engines, and when the lights go out, you release the dual clutch button, that starts to get the car moving forward. You then pull off the clutch, which helps you get away even faster, and you're done. And I love that Logitech has put this into an entry-level wheel. So overall, from my general impressions of the wheel, I'm pretty impressed, and I will definitely be using this wheel over my G29 because I like all of the extra information that I'm able to get through the Trueforce force feedback. I didn't like the new brake pedal as much, but it's something I think I will be able to get used to. And I see myself possibly wanting to upgrade my pedals down the road anyway, so it's not too big of a thing for me. I think a lot of sim racers wanted to see Logitech just kind of go balls to the wall and completely produce a full range of wheels, or maybe a super high-end wheel that compete with the likes of Fanatec's DD1 and wheels like the Sim Magic and AccuForce, and that's just absolutely not what they did. And I can understand people being somewhat disappointed at that. I hope that Logitech will continue to kind of develop a more improved, higher tier wheel. But what they look to do here was take the G29, add Trueforce, and whether or not you think Trueforce is something that you want will basically determine whether or not you want to buy this wheel or get the previous generation wheel. Logitech did mention that they are not going to be discontinuing the G29 or G920 for some time, so if the price is a non-starter for you, then you can choose to get the G29 or the G920. Unfortunately, with the G920, you take a loss in the total number of inputs, but you have choice. And that's why I'm really happy to see this wheel coming out, is because it offers more choice in that entry-level market. Essentially, Logitech and Thrustmaster are the only two producers in that market. If you go below the kind of $150 mark, you do get some offerings from companies like Ori and some other really low end stuff that don't have force feedback. But I would recommend starting at least a $200 mark and looking at both the G29, G920. You've got the Thrustmaster TMX and the Thrustmaster T150. I'd skip over those and go to the TMX and T150 Pros, because the default pedals that come with the non-pro versions are kind of bad. There's only 2 pedals on them, and they're all plastic. And the same price point as the G923 from Thrustmaster, you have T300 RS for PlayStation, and then you have the TX for Xbox and PC. Now, I do have access to a TX. One of my buddy has one of those, and I do plan on borrowing it, so I can do a little bit of head-to-head with both the Thrustmaster and the Logitech wheels to just get a feel for what the differences are. The TX uses a belt-driven system, which a lot of people say they prefer to the geared system. So I want to try it out and do some comparisons, just so I have a wider wealth of knowledge onto which to base my suggestions. In general, for something that's so experiential as a wheel, I suggest, if you can get your hands on one, perhaps at a demo pod at something like Micro Center or Best Buy, do so. Of course, be safe. You know, in these current times with a pandemic going on, wear gloves, wear a mask, wear a full hazmat suit. But it's so hard for me to make a recommendation on something like this. Force feedback is so subjective, and that's going to be the main determination of whether you like one wheel or another wheel for the most part in this lower end. So if you can get your hands on one, do so. But I understand that not everybody's going to be able to. So hopefully I've provided enough information for you to be able to make the best buying decision that you can. So that's it for this video. It's another long video for me, but hopefully you've come to expect that. If you made it to the end of the video, give me a 7 wide or fast in, slow out, since I'm wearing the Dan Suzuki shirt, in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to know anything else about this wheel or anything else I mentioned, please let me know in the comments. Follow me on social media. I have links to that if you want to talk about things more. And I can tell you some of the Discords I'm a member on, where I found out a lot about sim racing to hopefully help you get a lot more information. Thanks again. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.